The last orphan had been delivered to the small schoolhouse in Hope's Crossing just after midnight. She was a slip of a thing, no older than 5, her small fingers wrapped tight around a worn rag doll and her eyes hollow with a grief too vast for her tiny frame. Eliza Monroe stood at the door, her 26-year-old body aching with exhaustion. But her resolve was an unwavering flame against the encroaching darkness. As she welcomed the child, Emily, inside with the others, she knew she was not fighting for a position anymore. She was fighting for 6 souls. 6 orphans now slept on makeshift pallets throughout her modest quarters, the small living space attached to the one-room schoolhouse where she taught. They were the tragic legacy of the typhoid fever that had swept through the mining settlement over the past month, a brutal reminder of how quickly life could be extinguished in the Wyoming territory of 1878. Hope's Crossing had sprung up like so many frontier towns, hastily built around a silver strike that promised riches but, for most, delivered only hardship. The town council had hired Eliza 2 years prior, fresh from her teacher's college back east, her head full of ideals and an eagerness to bring education to the frontier. Now that same council was demanding she surrender her charges or lose everything. The conflict had been laid bare that morning in a tense confrontation with Mayor Thompson. She could still see him standing in the doorway of her schoolhouse, his jowls quivering with indignation. "Miss Monroe, your duty is to teach, not to harbor strays," he had informed her, his voice devoid of sympathy. "These children are a burden on the town's limited resources. They will be collected tomorrow and sent to proper institutions on the orphan train." "Proper institutions?" Eliza had countered, her voice level despite the fury building inside her. "They've just lost their parents, their homes. They are grieving. Sending them away from the only place they've ever known would only deepen their trauma." The mayor had straightened his waistcoat over his substantial belly, his expression unyielding. "The decision is final. They will be placed with families back east, families who can provide for them, families looking for help on their farms." He'd looked at her then, his eyes small and hard. "You are overstepping your position, Miss Monroe. Remember that you serve at the pleasure of this council." Now, in the dim, flickering light of her single oil lamp, Eliza watched the children sleep, and the mayor's cold words felt like a desecration of the fragile peace in the room. Little Mary, her copper hair splayed across the pillow like a fiery halo. The Sullivan brothers, Tom and Peter, curled together for comfort like a pair of stray puppies, Sarah clutching the same worn doll her mother had made for her. Leo, the quiet, thoughtful one, with his ever-present book resting on the floor beside his pallet. And now Emily, who had finally cried herself to sleep in the rocking chair, her small body racked with silent sobs. Eliza sank into that same chair, gently lifting the sleeping child into her arms. The orphan train, a symbol of cold, institutional charity, would arrive tomorrow afternoon. She had less than a day to find a miracle. Sleep would not come tonight, not with the weight of 6 young lives resting so heavily upon her. Dawn broke with a spray of liquid gold across the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains. Eliza had spent the long hours of the night not sleeping, but planning, drafting letters to distant relatives she barely knew, making lists of the town's more charitable citizens, and praying for a divine intervention that seemed increasingly unlikely. As the first rays of light touched the dusty floorboards of her small room, a defiant certainty settled in her heart. She would not let these children be scattered to the winds like so much chaff. They would not be taken, not without a fight. The children stirred one by one, their morning rituals subdued by the grief and uncertainty that hung in the air. The smell of frying batter, however, was a universal comfort. "Miss Monroe, are you making pancakes?" Leo asked, his 7-year-old face, usually so serious, lighting up with a flicker of childish delight. "I certainly am," Eliza replied, forcing a cheerfulness into her voice that she did not feel. It was a small act of normalcy, a loving defiance against the chaos that threatened them. "And we have just enough molasses to make them special." As the children gathered around the small table, their faces momentarily brightened by the simple breakfast. Eliza knew she had to tell them. She explained the situation as gently as she could, framing it not as a cruel eviction, but as a disagreement about what was best for them. "The mayor believes you should go to new homes, to families who can care for you properly," she said, choosing her words with immense care. "But I believe you belong here, with each other, with the memories of your parents." "I don't want to leave," Mary whispered, her blue eyes welling with tears. A chorus of agreement rippled through the other children. "Neither do I," Eliza assured them, her hand coming to rest on Mary's shoulder. "So today, after we've had our breakfast, we are going to walk into town together. We are going to visit some friends and see if anyone can help us find a way to stay." An hour later, they were ready. Eliza had dressed them in their best clothes, patched and worn as they were, scrubbing their faces and braiding the girls' hair until they shone. They were not strays to be swept away. They were the children of Hope's Crossing, and she would make the town see them as such. Holding Emily's hand in her right and Leo's in her left, with the others trailing closely behind, she led them out of the schoolhouse and onto the dusty main street. They were a small, determined procession, a fragile chain against the world, marching forward to begin a battle she had almost no chance of winning. In the West, hope often arrived in the most unexpected of forms, and Eliza Monroe, having exhausted every conventional avenue, was about to discover that her last, desperate chance came in the form of a tall stranger with kind eyes. This was the chapter's hook, the shift from certain failure to a single, improbable opportunity. The setting was the dusty main street of Hope's Crossing, a place that now felt hostile and indifferent. Under the harsh glare of the midday sun, the familiar storefronts seemed to mock Eliza with their closed-off expressions. Each door she had knocked on had been a quiet but firm rejection. The blacksmith was sorry, but he had 4 of his own to feed. The doctor's wife offered a prayer but had no room. Even the saloon owner, a man not known for his piety, had simply shaken his head. The town, cowed by the council's authority, had turned its back on its own. The final stop was Fitzpatrick's General Store, a place that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. It was Eliza's last hope. Mr. Fitzpatrick was a decent man, but he was also a cautious one, his livelihood dependent on the goodwill of the town's leadership. The conflict was stark and immediate. Eliza's moral plea versus the town's pragmatic fear. The rising action of her desperate campaign reached its quiet, heartbreaking conclusion inside the store. "Mr. Fitzpatrick, I am not asking for charity," Eliza pleaded, her voice hoarse from a morning of fruitless appeals. "I am simply looking for someone, anyone, willing to speak on our behalf at the council. To attest that these children belong here, Mr. Fitzpatrick, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose, avoided her gaze, busying himself by rearranging a stack of canned peaches. "I sympathize, Miss Monroe, truly I do. But my wife and I are too old to take in youngsters and crossing the council." He let the sentence hang, the unfinished thought more damning than any outright refusal. It was in that moment of utter defeat that the bell above the door jangled. A man stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of sagebrush and the open range. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and when he removed his hat, revealing a tumble of dark, sun-streaked hair, Eliza recognized him as the man she had noticed earlier, the one directing the unloading of a supply wagon. "Ah, Mr. Sterling," Fitzpatrick called out, his relief at the interruption palpable. "Your supplies are ready." The man, Sterling, nodded in acknowledgement, but his gaze, a startling intense blue, lingered on Eliza and the small silent children huddled behind her skirt. He was not handsome in the classical sense. His face was too weathered, his jaw too square, but there was an undeniable strength and a quiet authority in his bearing. "Miss Monroe is our schoolteacher," Fitzpatrick explained, his voice low. "These little ones, orphans from the fever outbreak." Sterling stepped forward, extending a large, calloused hand to Eliza. "Ethan Sterling," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "I've just taken over the Redwood Creek Ranch, west of town." Eliza accepted his handshake, noting the firm, respectful grip. "Eliza Monroe, a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sterling. What brings all of you to the store today?" he asked, his kind eyes softening as he glanced at the children. Before Eliza could formulate a diplomatic response, Leo, the ever-forthright one, blurted out the truth. "The mayor's sending us away on a train, and Miss Monroe's trying to stop him, but nobody will help us." The climax of the chapter was not in a shout, but in the sudden, sharp focus of Ethan Sterling's attention. The casual curiosity in his eyes was replaced by a look of intense concentration. He did not dismiss the boy's words. He listened, and in his listening, everything changed. "Is that so?" he asked, his gaze shifting to Eliza. "The town council has decided the children should be sent east on the orphan train," Eliza explained, her chin lifting with a defiant pride. I believe they belong here, in the only home they've ever known." "And you're taking them in?" he asked. "I am trying to," she confirmed. The resolution began with a simple, unexpected act of respect. Ethan Sterling studied her for a long moment. Then he crouched down to Leo's level. "What's your name, partner?" He didn't rush. He didn't patronize. He shook each child's hand, asked their names, and listened to their whispered replies as if their words were the most important thing in the world. When he straightened up, a decision had clearly been made. He looked at Eliza. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I would like to hear more about this situation. Would you and your charges do me the honor of joining me for lunch at the hotel restaurant?" The transition was a seismic shift in Eliza's desperate day. A moment ago, she had been standing on the precipice of failure. Now, a stranger had offered not just a meal, but a lifeline. Unsure if he was a savior or simply a momentary delay of the inevitable, but with no other options left, she accepted. As they walked out of the store and toward the hotel, the fate of 6 children now rested in the hands of a man they had only just met. A simple lunch at the hotel restaurant became a council of war, and the fate of 6 children was the main item on the agenda. The hook was the stark contrast between the setting, a quiet, respectable dining room, and the revolutionary plan that was about to be conceived within its walls. The narrative moved from the relative sanctuary of the restaurant to the cold, formal meeting room of the town hall. The shift in setting highlighted the transition from a private conversation between 2 individuals to a public confrontation with the town's established power structure. Ethan Sterling, over plates of roast beef and potatoes, revealed himself to be a man of decisive action and strategic thinking. Eliza, in turn, transitioned from a lone advocate to a powerful partner, her moral conviction now backed by Ethan's formidable presence and resources. The town council, represented by the pompous Mayor Thompson, was cast as the inflexible, bureaucratic obstacle they had to overcome. The central conflict was clear and immediate. They had to convince a stubborn and unsympathetic council to reverse its decision, and they had to do it before the orphan train, a physical manifestation of their deadline, arrived in town. The rising action began during the meal. Eliza laid out the full situation, her voice filled with a passion born of desperation and love. Ethan listened, not just to her words, but to the small, sad interjections from the children. "The mayor says Miss Monroe can't keep us because she's just a teacher," Mary said, her voice small. "But she tells us stories when we're scared." Ethan's jaw tightened. When Eliza finished, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered a plan. "We're going to the town hall," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Right now." At the town hall, they faced the 4 stony-faced members of the council. Ethan, standing tall and confident, began the negotiation. He presented his first offer, a significant financial contribution from the Redwood Creek Ranch to cover all costs associated with the children's care to be managed by Miss Monroe. "A generous offer, Mr. Sterling," Mayor Thompson said, steepling his fingers. "However, the issue is not merely financial. It is a matter of propriety. It is simply not proper for a single, unmarried woman to raise 6 children on her own." The council's objection, couched in the language of morality, seemed insurmountable. Eliza's heart sank. They had come so close. The climax of the chapter was Ethan's immediate, stunning counter-proposal. He didn't pause. He didn't hesitate. He looked directly at Mayor Thompson, his blue eyes unwavering. "Then she will not be alone." He turned his gaze from the council to Eliza, and in that moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice carrying with absolute clarity, "I admire your courage and your heart. If you are willing, I propose that we raise them together." A collective gasp went through the room. Eliza stared at him, speechless. "A partnership," he clarified, though his eyes held a deeper question. "I can provide the home and the financial support. You can provide the daily care and education. Together, we can give these children the life they deserve." The resolution was the council's complete and utter disarray. Ethan's offer had systematically dismantled every one of their objections. It was a checkmate. They could no longer argue about finances, nor could they argue about propriety in the face of such a comprehensive, if unconventional, plan. "The orphan train arrives in less than 2 hours," Eliza reminded them, finding her voice. "These children need an answer now." Forced into a corner, Mayor Thompson grudgingly conceded. "The council will reconsider," he stammered, "provided a formal legal guardianship agreement is drafted." The transition was a triumphant exit from the town hall. The immediate threat had been neutralized. As they stepped out into the afternoon sun, the children cheering around them, a new and far more complex reality began to dawn. Eliza Monroe and Ethan Sterling, two people who had been strangers just hours before, were now bound together by a shared, life-altering responsibility. They had won the battle, but now they had to figure out how to live with the terms of their incredible, unexpected victory. A legal agreement can create a partnership, but only a shared home can begin to build a family. The hook for this chapter was the journey from the dusty, familiar streets of Hope's Crossing to the sprawling, unknown territory of the Redwood Creek Ranch. For the children and for Eliza, it was a journey into a new world. The setting was the ranch itself. It was a place of vast, open spaces, a stark contrast to the cramped schoolhouse quarters. The main house was sturdy and large, but carried an air of lonely masculinity. A space that was functional but lacked a woman's touch. It was a landscape of potential, a blank canvas upon which their new family could be painted. The children were the central focus of this chapter. Their reactions, a mixture of awe, excitement, and lingering apprehension, driving the narrative. Ethan was no longer a stranger, but a host, a potential father figure, his competence and kindness on full display in his own element. Eliza found herself in the role of observer, her heart filled with relief for the children, but also a quiet uncertainty about her own place in this new arrangement. The central conflict was a gentle, internal one. How does a group of strangers, each carrying their own grief and history, begin to feel like a family? How does this unconventional, platonic arrangement function in the day-to-day reality of shared living? The rising action began the moment their wagon rolled under the arched gateway of the Redwood Creek Ranch. The children, who had been subdued on the ride, gasped at the sight of the open pastures and the sheer number of horses in the corral. Ethan introduced them to his foreman, Hank, a grizzled older man with a surprisingly gentle smile, who welcomed them without a hint of surprise, as if a schoolteacher and 6 orphans arriving was the most natural thing in the world. As Ethan gave them a tour of the house, the children's shyness melted away. Leo discovered a small library of books in the parlor. Mary was captivated by the large kitchen garden. The Sullivan boys stood in silent awe before the stables. Each child, in their own way, began to find a small piece of the ranch that they could connect with. It was during this tour that Ethan, in a quiet moment with Eliza on the front porch, revealed the personal motivation behind his extraordinary offer. He told her how his own father had taken him in after his mother died, raising him alone on this very ranch. "He gave me a home when I had none," Ethan said, his voice low. "I suppose I'm just trying to do the same." The climax of the chapter was not a moment of high drama, but one of quiet, domestic partnership. That evening, after a boisterous dinner, they sat together at the large kitchen table to draft the formal guardianship agreement for the council. The children were asleep upstairs, their quiet breathing a soft rhythm in the house. As Ethan and Eliza worked, their heads bent over the paper, a sense of normalcy settled over them. They discussed bedtimes, chores, and lesson plans. It was a profoundly intimate, yet completely practical moment that solidified their partnership more than any legal document could. The resolution was a clear, workable plan. The children would stay with Eliza in town during the school week and come to the ranch every weekend. It was a sensible solution that respected Eliza's role as their teacher and integrated them into the life of the ranch. The transition to the next phase of their life occurred when Eliza, realizing the lateness of the hour, prepared to take the children back to town. "Stay the night," Ethan said, his tone casual, but his eyes earnest. "It's late, and the road is dark. The children are already settled." Eliza hesitated, but the logic was undeniable. She agreed. It was the first night they would all spend under the same roof, a small but significant step. As she lay in the comfortable guest bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, the low nicker of a horse, the distant call of a coyote, she reflected on the incredible, dizzying turn her life had taken. She was no longer alone in her fight. She had a partner, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the quiet, unfamiliar stirring of hope. A family is not created by a single grand decision, but woven together by 100 small, repeated moments. A shared meal, a bedtime story, a lesson patiently taught. The hook for this chapter was the establishment of this new, unconventional rhythm, the weekly migration of their small flock between the town and the ranch, a rhythm that would begin to shape them all. The setting was defined by this weekly contrast. The weekdays were spent in the cramped but familiar schoolhouse in Hope's Crossing, a world of books, slates, and structured learning under Eliza's gentle guidance. The weekends were spent at the Redwood Creek Ranch, a world of wide open spaces, physical work, and practical lessons under Ethan's patient tutelage. This duality highlighted the two essential halves of the children's new upbringing, mind and body, community, and homestead. The characters settled into their new roles. Eliza was the heart of their family, the source of comfort, stability, and education. Ethan was the anchor, providing security, adventure, and a connection to the land. The children, thriving under this dual influence, began to heal. Their individual personalities, once muted by grief, started to shine through. The central conflict of the chapter was the ongoing, gentle challenge of blending these two disparate worlds and two different caregivers into a single, cohesive family unit. It was a test of patience, communication, and the growing bond between Eliza and Ethan. The rising action unfolded over a series of weekends. Ethan taught the boys, Leo and the Sullivans, how to mend fences and care for the horses. They followed him like loyal shadows, their small chests puffed out with pride at being given real responsibilities. Eliza and the girls, Mary, Sarah, and Emily, took over the kitchen garden, their combined efforts yielding a bounty of vegetables that they all took pride in. One night at the ranch, Tom Sullivan, the older of the two brothers, woke from a nightmare, his cries echoing through the quiet house. Both Eliza and Ethan rushed to his side. Eliza held him, stroking his hair and murmuring soothing words, while Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his solid, calming presence a silent promise of safety. In that moment, sharing the responsibility of comforting a frightened child, they ceased to be just partners and became, unequivocally, parents. Their arrangement did not go unnoticed. Mayor Thompson, true to his bureaucratic nature, paid an official, unscheduled visit to the schoolhouse one afternoon, clearly looking for faults. He found 6 clean, well-behaved children diligently working on their arithmetic and left with a grudging nod, unable to find any grounds for his disapproval. Their small victory was a quiet affirmation of their success. As the weeks passed, the conversations between Eliza and Ethan grew deeper. They no longer just talked about the children, they began to share more of themselves, their dreams for the future, their memories of the past. The climax of the chapter was the town's 4th of July celebration. It was their first public appearance as a complete family unit. They sat together on a large quilt, sharing a picnic basket, surrounded by the rest of the town. As the fireworks exploded in the night sky, painting bursts of color against the velvet darkness, little Emily, who had been sitting between them, drowsily leaned her head against Eliza's shoulder, reached out a small hand to take Ethan's, and called them for the first time, Mama and Papa. The resolution was the profound emotional silence that fell between Eliza and Ethan at the child's innocent declaration. The simple words spoken without thought had given a name to what they had become. It legitimized their bond in a way no legal document ever could. They looked at each other over the heads of the sleeping children, and in that shared glance, a new understanding passed between them. The transition to the next phase was a quiet but significant choice. Because the hour was late, Ethan had reserved rooms at the hotel. As he walked Eliza and the girls to their door, the awareness of their new titles, Mama and Papa, hung in the air. The lines of their platonic partnership had become beautifully, irrevocably blurred. The question was no longer if their arrangement would work, but what this powerful, unexpected connection would become. There are questions that cannot be avoided forever, and the most pressing question at Redwood Creek was no longer about the children's future, but about the future of the two people who had become their world. The hook for this chapter was the shift in focus from the family they were building to the man and woman at its center. The setting was the Redwood Creek Ranch on a warm summer evening. After the children were soundly asleep, the world shrank to the quiet intimacy of the front porch, the air filled with the scent of pine and the gentle chirping of crickets. The vast, star-dusted Montana sky served as a breathtaking backdrop for a conversation that would change everything. Eliza and Ethan were now completely at ease in each other's presence, a comfortable partnership that had become the bedrock of their lives. They had learned to read each other's moods, to anticipate each other's needs, to finish each other's sentences. The admiration they held for one another was a constant, steady presence. The central conflict was no longer external, but a deeply personal and internal one. Both Eliza and Ethan had come to recognize the true nature of their feelings, but a formidable barrier of uncertainty and fear held them back. Eliza feared that complicating their perfect partnership with romance might shatter it. Ethan feared that Eliza's feelings were born of gratitude and necessity, not genuine love, and he could not, take advantage of that. The rising action unfolded in the quiet rhythm of their evening ritual. After the last bedtime story was told and the last child was tucked in, they would meet on the porch. These conversations, once focused on the children, had grown more personal. Tonight, they spoke of their own pasts. Eliza talked about her quiet, bookish childhood in Boston, a world away from this rugged life she had come to love. Ethan spoke of his father, a man who had taught him that strength was measured not by what you could take, but by what you could build and protect. "He would have liked you," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "He would have admired your fire." "And my mother would have been utterly baffled by you," Eliza countered with a soft laugh. "But she would have seen your goodness." The easy intimacy of the moment, the way they spoke of family and belonging, brought their unspoken feelings to the forefront. Ethan fell silent, his gaze fixed on the distant, star-lit horizon. Finally, he turned to her. The climax was his declaration, a moment of profound vulnerability. He took a deep breath, the sound loud in the quiet night. "Eliza," he began, his voice laced with an emotion she had never heard from him before. Our arrangement, it started for the children. I know that. But for me, it has become something else entirely." He looked at her, his blue eyes earnest and searching in the moonlight. "I've fallen in love with you, not as my partner or as the mother of our children, but as the woman you are, the bravest, kindest, most remarkable woman I have ever known." The resolution was the quiet, joyful release of a truth she had been holding in her own heart. The fear and uncertainty that had held her back dissolved in the face of his honest, heartfelt confession. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I love you too. I think I have for a very long time." He reached for her then, his hands gently cupping her face as he leaned in. Their first kiss was not a spark, but a slow, deep burn. It was a kiss that tasted of shared struggles and quiet victories, of mutual respect and a love that had grown as steadily and surely as the redwoods for which the ranch was named. The transition to their new reality was sealed in that embrace. They were no longer just partners in a guardianship agreement. They were a man and a woman in love, their future now intertwined by choice, not just by circumstance. They made a decision. They would get married, not for propriety or for the town council, but for themselves and for the family they had already, in their hearts, become. For the first time in its short, tumultuous history, a wedding in Hope's Crossing was not about the merging of property or the forging of alliances. It was about the official, joyful celebration of a family. The hook was this sense of communal celebration, a town coming together to honor the unconventional family that had, in its own way, taught them a lesson about what truly mattered. The setting was a town transformed. The narrative moved between the bustling preparations at the Redwood Creek Ranch and the supportive atmosphere of Hope's Crossing itself. The dusty streets that had once seemed so indifferent now felt like home, lined with neighbors who offered smiles and helping hands. The wedding itself would take place not in the small church, but at the ranch, under a sprawling, ancient oak tree that the children had christened the family tree. Eliza and Ethan were no longer a curiosity, but a beloved couple, their happiness infectious. The children were central characters, their unbridled excitement a driving force in the chapter. Even Mayor Thompson, representing the town's initial opposition, now appeared as a changed man, humbled and supportive. The central conflict of this chapter was a joyous, low-stakes one, the delightful chaos of planning a wedding with 6 enthusiastic, opinionated children who all wanted a role in the proceedings. It was a conflict of love, not of fear. The rising action unfolded in a flurry of happy preparations. When Eliza and Ethan announced their engagement to the children, the news was met with a jubilant uproar. Their quiet farmhouse was suddenly filled with the children's imaginative and often impractical wedding plans. "Can we have a 5-layer cake?" Peter, the ever-practical one, demanded. "And can the horses be the ring bearers?" Jacob chimed in. The news spread through Hope's Crossing, and the community responded with an outcry. with an outpouring of support that deeply moved Eliza. The women from the church sewing circle who had once whispered about her impropriety now volunteered to help sew the girls' dresses. Mr. Fitzpatrick donated a barrel of his finest apple cider for the reception. The town, which had once tried to tear their small family apart, now rallied to build it up. Eliza and Ethan made a formal trip to the county seat, not just to file for a marriage license, but to begin the official adoption process for all 6 children. It was a quiet, profound moment, a legal affirmation of the bond that had already been forged in their hearts. The climax was the wedding day itself. The sun shone brightly on a perfect September afternoon. The entire town, it seemed, had gathered at the Redwood Creek Ranch. The children, looking scrubbed and cherubic, fulfilled their roles with solemn pride. Mary and Sarah scattered petals. Leo stood as Ethan's best man, and Tom and Peter walked Eliza down the aisle, one on each arm, before presenting her to her future husband. Emily, the youngest, held the rings tied to a satin pillow. As Eliza stood before Ethan, surrounded by their children and their community, she looked into his eyes and her heart was filled with a sense of peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Their vows, spoken in clear, steady voices, were not just to each other, but to the 6 young souls who stood beside them. "I promise," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, "to be your husband, your partner, and your friend. And I promise to be the father that these children deserve." The resolution was the joyous celebration that followed. It was more of a community picnic than a formal reception. Laughter and fiddle music filled the air as children and adults alike celebrated the union. Mayor Thompson approached Ethan, his hand outstretched. "You taught us a lesson about what a community is supposed to be, Sterling," he said, his voice sincere. "Thank you." The transition to their new life was complete. The legal papers had been signed, the vows had been spoken, the community had given its blessing. They were no longer an arrangement, no longer a partnership, no longer an unconventional solution. They were, simply and beautifully, the Sterling family, whole and complete. The greatest legacy a person can leave behind is not one of land or silver, but of a family built on a foundation of unwavering love. The hook for this final chapter was a jump forward in time, a snapshot of the future they had fought so hard to create, proving that the fire of hope they had kindled had grown into an enduring, life-giving flame. The setting was the Redwood Creek Ranch. 10 years later, the house had expanded, a new wing added to accommodate a growing family. The land was prosperous, the pastures green and dotted with a healthy, thriving herd. It was a place of established peace and abundance, a physical testament to their hard work and happiness. The characters were now a sprawling, happy family. Eliza and Ethan, their faces etched with the fine lines of time and laughter, were the calm, loving center of their world. The 6 orphans had grown into capable, confident young adults, their childhood grief transformed into a deep sense of belonging. The family was completed by the addition of their 2 biological children, a boy and a girl, who served as a living bridge between the 2 halves of their family. The conflict in this chapter was the gentle, retrospective one of time itself. It was a look back at their journey, a moment of reflection on how far they had come, and a celebration of the legacy they had built together. There was no external threat, only the profound and satisfying resolution of a life well lived. The rising action unfolded on a warm afternoon as the entire Sterling clan gathered at the ranch for their annual Thanksgiving dinner. The scene was one of joyful chaos. Jacob, now a strapping young man of 17, and Ethan's right-hand man, was teaching his younger half-brother how to mend a saddle. Mary, whose gift for gardening had blossomed into a thriving business supplying produce to the town, was in the kitchen with Eliza, their laughter mingling with the scent of roasting turkey. The other children, each successful in their own right, had returned home, bringing with them stories of their lives in the wider world. As they all gathered around the massive dining table, expanded to fit their large family, Ethan stood to offer a toast. He raised his glass, his eyes finding Eliza's across the table, his love for her as clear and bright as it had been on their wedding day. The climax was his simple, heartfelt speech. "I am a blessed man," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "And my greatest blessing is this family, a family brought to us by the courage of one woman." He looked at Eliza, a woman who came to a desperate town and refused to let its heart go cold. She taught us all that a family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build with love, with patience, and with a fire in your heart that refuses to go out. The resolution was the chorus of "Here, here," and the raising of glasses around the table. Each of the older children shared a brief, heartfelt memory, a testament to the love and stability Eliza and Ethan had given them. It was a powerful, emotional culmination of their entire journey. The final transition brought the story to its quiet, perfect close. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the house had settled into a peaceful quiet, Eliza and Ethan sat on the front porch, just as they had so many times before. The children were all asleep, their futures bright and secure. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked softly, his arm wrapped securely around her. "Marrying a stranger to save 6 children?" Eliza smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I didn't marry a stranger, Ethan Sterling," she said, her voice filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "I married the heart of my family." She looked out at the peaceful valley, bathed in the soft light of the moon. The fire of hope they had ignited in a small, desperate town had not only saved 6 children, it had forged a legacy of love, a testament to the extraordinary power of an ordinary woman's promise and a good man's compassionate heart.